1912, a traveling photographer named Elias Dorsey documented a wedding inside a timber chapel hidden in the Blue Ridge Hollows of Virginia. The groom was Raymond Carr, 26, gaunt yet proud. The bride was Margaret Carr, 44, her own son, draped in a hand-sewn lace gown. Villagers whispered that an earlier fever had left mother and son the last of their line. The camera flash froze their vows beside a crude wooden altar. The plate vanished until 2015, when a demolition crew found it sealed behind a false wall of an abandoned veterans hospital. A museum curator observed the eerie facial symmetry of bride and groom and forwarded the plate to a genetics historian. Parish ledgers confirmed the ceremony, and a coroner ledger from the previous winter listed 5 unnamed infant deaths on the Carr farm. Ultra-resolution scanning exposed a faint carving on the altar plank reading, "Keep the blood pure," and twin wedding bands engraved "Matri Filius." Chemical analysis revealed traces of lamb blood brushed on the silver surface to deepen background shadows. When the story reached regional papers, descendants attempted to seize the image, yet state archivists kept it on public display, forcing a community to confront its buried disgrace. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos. The year was 2015. A demolition crew worked under the humid Virginia sun. They were tearing down the old Crestwood Veterans Hospital. The building had been abandoned for decades. Its halls were filled with dust and forgotten memories. A worker swung a sledgehammer into a plaster wall. The wall crumbled easily, revealing a hollow space behind it. Inside the dark cavity sat a small wooden box. The foreman, a man named Gus, carefully retrieved it. The box was sealed with wax and showed no markings. He pried it open with a crowbar. Inside, nestled in yellowed cotton batting, was a single glass plate negative. It was heavy and cool to the touch. The image was a formal portrait of a man and a woman. They stood stiffly in what looked like a rustic church. Gus thought it was strange, but placed the box in his truck. He planned to take it to the local historical society after his shift. He had no idea he held a secret over a century old. The next day, the glass plate rested on the desk of Dr. Eris Thorne. He was the chief curator for the regional museum. He held the plate up to the light, his brow furrowed in concentration. The image was remarkably well preserved. It depicted a wedding scene of stark and unsettling strangeness. The groom was young, perhaps in his mid-20s. His face was thin and his eyes held a haunted, hollow look. The bride was significantly older, her face lined with a life of hardship. Yet it was their resemblance that struck Dr. Thorne. They shared the same high cheekbones, the same narrow nose, the same deep-set eyes. It was a family resemblance so strong it was almost unnatural. He initially assumed they were brother and sister, but the white gown and the way they held hands suggested a marriage. The setting was equally strange. The chapel was built of rough-hewn logs. A crude wooden cross hung on the wall behind them. The altar was a simple plank of wood set on 2 stumps. The entire scene felt isolated, hidden away from the world. Dr. Thorne felt a professional thrill mixed with a sense of unease. He knew this photograph was important. It told a story that needed to be understood. He decided to have the plate professionally scanned and analyzed. He wanted to uncover every detail hidden within the silver and glass. He could not yet imagine the darkness he was about to uncover. The photograph was a doorway to a forgotten past. A past of secrets and sorrows buried deep in the Virginia mountains. Dr. Thorne sent a high-resolution digital copy to Dr. Lena Petrova. She was a renowned genetics historian at the University of Virginia. Her specialty was tracing lineage through facial morphology and historical records. She received the email and opened the attached file. The image filled her screen. She saw the gaunt groom and the older bride. She immediately noted the striking facial symmetry. The similarities were too pronounced for cousins or even typical siblings. She ran the image through her facial recognition software. The program compared thousands of points on their faces. The algorithm returned a probability match of 98.6% for a mother-son relationship. Dr. Petrova stared at the screen in disbelief. A marriage between a mother and her own son was not just taboo, it was a profound violation of natural and human law. She cross-referenced the estimated age of the photograph with local archives. The style of dress and the photographic process pointed to the early 1900s, specifically the period between 1910 and 1915. She needed more information. She needed names, dates, and a location. The photograph itself offered few clues, but what they discovered next would change everything. Dr. Thorne began a meticulous search of the old hospital's records. He learned it was built on land once owned by a single family, the Carr family. They had owned a large tract of land in the Blue Ridge Hollows since the late 1700s. The hospital was constructed in 1942, long after the family had seemingly died out. He found an old property map from 1900. It showed the Carr farm and, in a remote corner of the property, a small structure labeled simply as Chapel. This had to be the location in the photograph. The discovery gave them a name and a place: the Carr family of Briar Hollow. Dr. Petrova now had a starting point for her genealogical research. She focused her search on county records from the early 20th century. She looked for birth certificates, death certificates, and marriage licenses. The work was slow and painstaking. Many records from that era were incomplete or had been damaged over time. She spent days scrolling through microfilmed ledgers. The dust of the past seemed to fill the small library room. Finally, she found it. A marriage license dated April 12, 1912. The names listed were Raymond Carr and Margaret Carr. The groom's age was listed as 26. The bride's age was 44. The document confirmed the wedding, but it also deepened the mystery. Why would a mother marry her own son? What circumstances could lead to such a desperate act? The historical context of early 20th century Appalachia was crucial. The Blue Ridge Hollows were isolated communities. People lived according to their own rules and traditions. Outsiders were viewed with suspicion. Families were large and tightly knit, often intermarrying for generations to preserve land and bloodlines. This practice, while common, sometimes led to genetic problems. Dr. Petrova found census records for the Carr family. In 1890, the family was large and prosperous. Jacob and Sarah Carr had 7 children. Margaret was their eldest daughter. But by 1910, the census told a different story. The family had been decimated. A note in the margin, written by the census taker, mentioned a terrible fever that had swept through the hollow a few years prior. Scarlet fever or diphtheria were common and deadly. The note stated that only Margaret Carr and her young son, Raymond, had survived. They were the last of their line. This information provided a possible motive. A desperate attempt to continue the family name. A tragic choice made out of grief and isolation. Margaret, having lost her husband and all her other children, may have seen no other way. The family's legacy, their land, their very existence, rested on her and Raymond. The marriage was a pact to ensure the Carr name would not vanish from the earth. It was a sad story, but it seemed to explain the photograph. Yet some details still bothered Dr. Thorne and Dr. Petrova. The isolation of the chapel suggested secrecy. If the community accepted such practices in desperate times, why hide the wedding? They decided to look for church records. They found the parish registry for the circuit-riding preacher who served the Hollows. His name was Reverend Michael Abernathy. His ledger was filled with records of baptisms, marriages, and funerals. On the same date as the marriage license, April 12, 1912, there was an entry. It read, "United in holy matrimony, Raymond Carr and Margaret Carr at the family chapel." The entry was brief, almost clinical, but beneath it, the Reverend had added a personal note, a few lines written in a shaky, troubled hand. He wrote that he had performed the ceremony against his better judgment. He mentioned the family's immense grief and their insistence. He wrote that the mother claimed it was God's will to keep the blood pure. The phrase struck a chilling chord. Keep the blood pure. It sounded less like a lament of grief and more like a doctrinal command. It hinted at a belief system that went beyond simple desperation. It suggested a deliberate, long-standing practice. The secret kept for over a century was beginning to unravel. The investigation took a darker turn. Dr. Petrova searched for coroner's records from the years leading up to the wedding. She focused on the winter of 1911. It was a brutal winter, according to newspaper archives. Heavy snows had cut off the hollows for weeks at a time. She found the county coroner's ledger. It was a grim accounting of the year's dead. On a single page, dated February 1912, she found a disturbing entry. The coroner had been called to the Carr farm. He had recorded the deaths of 5 infants. None of them were named. Their cause of death was listed as failure to thrive. The entry was stark and horrifying. 5 infants dead on a single farm in one winter. The coroner had added a note. He wrote that the family refused to give him the infants' names or exact birth dates. They had already been buried in an unmarked plot behind the family chapel. He noted the family's strange lack of emotion. They seemed resigned, almost ritualistic in their grief. This discovery was horrifying. It cast the wedding photograph in a new, sinister light. The marriage was not just about continuing a family line. It was connected to the deaths of these children. Were they Raymond's children? If so, who were the mothers? The isolation of the Carr farm suddenly seemed less like a geographic fact and more like a carefully maintained prison. The team decided to re-examine the photograph itself. They had the original glass plate. They would use the most advanced technology available. The plate was sent to a specialized lab for ultra-resolution scanning. The process involved capturing the image at a microscopic level. It could reveal details invisible to the naked eye. The lab technicians carefully calibrated the scanner. The digital image slowly rendered on their monitors. It was thousands of times more detailed than the initial scan. Dr. Thorne and Dr. Petrova watched on a large screen. They zoomed in on the altar. The crude plank of wood was rough and weathered, but as they increased the magnification, something came into focus. Faint lines carved into the wood. They were almost worn away by time. The technician filtered the image, enhancing the contrast. The lines became clearer. They were letters. A phrase had been carefully carved into the front of the altar. It read, "Keep the blood pure." It was the same phrase the Reverend had written in his ledger. This was no mere family motto. It was the central tenet of their faith, carved into their place of worship. It was a command that had governed their lives and their deaths. The team then focused on the couple's hands. They were clasped together in the center of the photograph. They both wore simple wedding bands. The scanner zoomed in on the rings. The resolution was so high they could see the faint scratches on the metal surface, and on the inside of the bands they could see tiny engravings. The technician again enhanced the image. The letters were in Latin. On Margaret's ring, the word matri was visible. On Raymond's, filius, mother, son. The rings were a declaration, a proud statement of their forbidden union. They were not hiding their relationship. They were sanctifying it. The discovery sent a shiver down Dr. Petrova's spine. This was not a story of grief-stricken survivors. It was a story of a deliberate, multi-generational ritual. A cult of purity centered on the Carr family. The chapel was not a place of Christian worship. It was a temple to their own bloodline. The photograph was not a sad memento. It was a holy document. Modern technology was about to reveal the unthinkable. The lab had one more test to run: chemical analysis of the photographic plate itself. The photographer, Elias Dorsey, was known for his technical skill, but the background shadows in the Carr wedding photo were unusually deep and rich. Dr. Thorne had always found them slightly odd. The chemists took a microscopic sample from the plate's emulsion. They used mass spectrometry to identify its chemical components. The results came back the next day. The plate contained the expected silver halide, but it also contained something else: traces of albumin and hemoglobin, specifically lamb hemoglobin. The photographer had not used a standard chemical toner to deepen the shadows. He had used lamb's blood. He had brushed a thin layer of blood onto the plate during the development process. It was a bizarre and archaic technique, one that had no practical purpose. The use of blood was purely symbolic. It was a ritual element incorporated into the creation of the image itself. The blood of a sacrificial lamb, used to frame the unholy union. The photograph was now more than just a document. It was a ritual artifact, an object created with a specific occult purpose. The full, horrifying picture was now clear. The Carr family was not just an isolated Appalachian family. They were a cult. For generations, They had practiced a form of ancestor worship centered on the purity of their own blood. They believed they were a chosen line. They had to be kept separate and undiluted. This meant they could only reproduce with each other. The fever that swept through the hollow was not just a tragedy. It was a crisis that threatened their entire belief system. It left only Margaret and her son, Raymond. The 5 infant deaths were the result of this tradition. They were likely the children of Raymond and other female relatives before the fever. Or perhaps they were Margaret's own children, fathered by her son in a desperate attempt to produce a viable heir. The congenital defects from generations of inbreeding would have been severe. The infants born weak or deformed were considered failures. Their deaths were not tragic accidents. They were ritual sacrifices, a culling of the impure to protect the sacred bloodline. The marriage of Margaret and Raymond was the final, desperate act of this faith. The mother and son became the last hope for their cult. Their wedding was a ceremony to ensure its survival. They were not just marrying. They were performing a sacred duty to their ancestors and their god, the Carr blood itself. The story was leaked to the press. It started in a local Virginia paper. Then it was picked up by national news outlets. The headline was sensational. Incest Cult of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The photograph of Margaret and Raymond Carr was published everywhere. Their gaunt faces stared out from newspapers and computer screens. The public was both horrified and fascinated. The story of the Carr family became a national obsession. Soon, people claiming to be distant descendants of the Carrs came forward. They were from collateral branches of the family that had left the Hollows generations ago. They were horrified by the revelations. They felt their family name had been disgraced. A group of them filed a lawsuit. They wanted to seize the glass plate negative. They argued it was a private family matter. They wanted to destroy the photograph and bury the story forever. They claimed the museum was exploiting their family's tragedy for profit. The state archives stepped in. They argued the photograph was a historical document of immense importance. It was evidence of a dark chapter in the region's history, a chapter that needed to be remembered, not erased. The court sided with the state. The photograph was placed on public display at the museum. It was housed in a climate-controlled case, the centerpiece of a new exhibit on the hidden histories of Appalachia. The exhibit drew massive crowds. People stood in line for hours to see the photograph. They stared at the faces of Margaret and Raymond. They read the accompanying text detailing the investigation. The story forced the local community to confront its own past. Older residents came forward with stories they had heard as children, whispers of the strange Carr family who kept to themselves, rumors of babies who were born and then disappeared. The institutional silence that had protected the Carrs for so long was finally broken. The church, the county officials, the doctors of the past had all played a part. They had either turned a blind eye or were too intimidated to intervene. The Carr family's legacy was no longer one of proud landowners. It was a legacy of shame and abuse. The story served as a dark moral lesson, a warning about the dangers of isolation, extremism, and the secrets that families keep. The photograph of Margaret and Raymond Carr remains on display. It is a haunting reminder that the past is never truly gone. It lies buried, waiting for a crack in the wall to let the light in. The final truth, frozen in silver and blood, was a testament to a legacy of horror. A family's honor had been shattered by the very traditions meant to preserve it. The quest for truth had unearthed a pain that would now be part of public memory forever.